On March 10, 2019, Ethiopian Airlines Flight 302 took off from Addis Ababa. 6 minutes later, it crashed into a field 30 miles southeast of the airport. All 157 people on board were killed. It was the second crash of a Boeing 737 MAX in 5 months. But here's the thing, this was not a mystery. This was not an unknown risk. Inside Boeing, engineers had already figured out what went wrong. They had flagged it more than a year earlier. They had warned management in writing. And when the first crash happened in October 2018, killing 189 people on Lion Air Flight 610, Boeing's own internal analysis confirmed the engineers were right. The second crash was not a tragedy. Nobody saw coming. It was a tragedy Boeing chose not to prevent. This is not a story about a faulty aircraft. It is a story about what happens when a company has the warnings, has the data, has the engineers telling them to stop, and keeps going anyway. To understand what killed 346 people, you have to understand one system. MCAS, the Maneuvering Characteristics Augmentation System. The 737 MAX was Boeing's upgrade to its best-selling aircraft. The problem was the engines. Boeing wanted bigger, more fuel-efficient engines, but those engines were larger and mounted further forward on the wing than the older 737 design allowed. That changed how the aircraft behaved in flight. At high angles of attack, when the nose pointed too steeply upward, the new engine placement shifted the plane's aerodynamics. It could now stall in ways the older 737 could not. Not often, not in normal flight. But in a specific, narrow condition, the FAA would require Boeing to address this before certifying the aircraft. So Boeing created MCAS. Here is what MCAS did in plain language. It was a computer system that automatically pushed the aircraft nose down if it detected the plane was pitched too high. That was its entire job. One sensor, one command, push the nose down. If a single angle of attack sensor reported a high reading, MCAS would activate. It would push the nose down. The pilot would pull back to correct. MCAS would activate again, push down, pull back, push down, pull back, over and over. The pilots could disable MCAS, but they had to know it existed first. They had to know which switches cut power to the system. And Boeing made a decision that meant most pilots would not know either. Boeing classified MCAS as a non-critical system. Here is what non-critical meant in practice. It meant the FAA certification process did not require Boeing to prove the system was fail-safe. It meant Boeing did not have to include redundancy. It meant Boeing did not have to document MCAS in pilot training materials. It meant airlines did not have to be told the system existed. Pilots flying the 737 MAX for the first time did not know that if a single sensor failed, a hidden autopilot system would command the plane to dive repeatedly until they found switches they had never been trained to look for. During development, Boeing's own test pilots put MCAS, the Maneuvering Characteristics Augmentation System, through simulator scenarios. They documented what happened when the angle of attack sensor fed bad data. The system activated. The nose pitched down. The scenario they described in their report was what would later happen to Lion Air and Ethiopian Airlines. Their classification: catastrophic. The report circulated internally in 2016. Engineers read it, managers read it. The response was not to add a second sensor, it was not to inform pilots. The response was to keep MCAS classified as non-critical. After that report, a senior Boeing engineer raised formal concerns about the single sensor design in internal safety reviews. He pointed out that a single failure point on a system capable of overriding pilot input was a textbook hazard. The response was the same. MCAS was non-critical. A second sensor was not required. Pilot training was not required. The concern was noted and the design was not changed. He raised it again. The answer did not change. On October 29, 2018, Lion Air Flight 610 crashed into the Java Sea. 189 people died. The flight data recorder told the story. A faulty angle of attack sensor had activated MCAS repeatedly. The pilots fought the system for 11 minutes. They pulled back 21 times. MCAS pushed down 21 times. They did not know about the switches that could have stopped it. Within days, Boeing's own engineers analyzed the flight data. Their internal analysis, later made public during criminal proceedings, confirmed MCAS was the likely cause. The system they had been warned about. The sensor, they had been told, was a single failure point. The scenario the test pilots had described 2 years earlier. Boeing's response was not to ground the fleet. Boeing issued a bulletin to airlines, not an emergency airworthiness directive. A bulletin. The bulletin described the issue and told pilots how to disable MCAS the first time many of them learned the system existed. Meanwhile, Boeing continued assuring regulators and airlines that the 737 MAX was safe to fly. Internal messages recovered later showed executives discussing how to manage regulatory expectations while Boeing worked on a longer-term software fix. The aircraft kept flying for 4.5 more months. After the second crash in March 2019, multiple Boeing employees went public. They testified before Congress. They described a culture where raising safety issues meant being sidelined on projects. One engineer testified that they were told to stop asking questions. Another described the career cost of pushing back. When you flagged something as unsafe, you were not rewarded for thoroughness. You were marked as difficult. Your next assignment was not a promotion. It was a smaller project, a less important team, a quieter room. The pressure was not explicit. Nobody said ignore safety. Nobody said cut corners. The pressure showed up in 1,000 small decisions. A system classified as non-critical when it should have been critical. A pilot training requirement waived. A second sensor deemed optional. A certification timeline accelerated. Each decision individually justifiable, but collectively, they produced an aircraft that killed 346 people. Ethiopian Airlines Flight 302. Another faulty angle of attack sensor. Another MCAS activation. Another crew fighting a system they did not know existed. The pilots radioed they had a flight control problem. They requested clearance to climb. They were fighting the aircraft the entire time. MCAS pushed down. They pulled back. MCAS pushed down again. They were in the air for 6 minutes. By the time they may have understood what was happening, if they ever did, the aircraft was too low to recover. All 157 people died. Within hours, regulators around the world grounded the 737 MAX. Not Boeing, the regulators. The aircraft Boeing had assured was safe was removed from service globally. The grounding lasted 20 months, the longest grounding of a commercial aircraft in United States history. The investigation that followed released documents Boeing had fought to keep confidential, the emails, the test pilot reports from 2016, the internal safety reviews, the analysis after Lion Air showing they knew what had gone wrong and chose not to ground the fleet, the messages from executives discussing regulatory strategy rather than aircraft safety. Boeing settled criminal charges with a $2.5 billion penalty. The Department of Justice found that Boeing had concealed MCAS from the FAA during certification. The paper trail proved what the engineers had been saying all along they knew. The MAX eventually returned to service in late 2020. By then, it had the redundancy the engineers had requested 5 years earlier. A second sensor, pilot training on MCAS. The changes that had been recommended, documented, and ignored before a single passenger had ever stepped on board. The whistleblowers were vindicated. Not in a way that brings back 346 people, but in a way that matters. The paper trail proved them right. Boeing knew. Their engineers told them, their test pilots told them, the data told them, the first crash told them, and still, they let the planes keep flying. Every disaster leaves a paper trail. We follow it.